The night the U.S. Navy lost 3 ships in 30 minutes. The night the ocean set a trap. The waters off Guadalcanal were quiet that evening, too quiet for a place that had earned the name Iron Bottom Sound. Every sailor who approached that dark, restless patch of ocean knew the stories. Ships disappearing into the night, towering fireballs that illuminated mountains, and explosions so violent they shook the seafloor. Dozens of ships already lay below, both American and Japanese. Cruisers, destroyers, transports, even battleships. All of them victims of the savage struggle for one small island that neither side was willing to surrender. By November 1942, the fight for Guadalcanal had become something far worse than a battle. It was a grinding test of endurance, courage, and supply lines, a place where mistakes were paid for with ships, and victories were measured in hours gained, not miles taken. The Japanese still believed they could break the American foothold. Their destroyers, fast, deadly, expertly handled, raced down the narrow channel known as the Slot, night after night, bringing food, ammunition, and reinforcements to troops who were starving in the jungle. The Americans called these missions the Tokyo Express. It was the Tokyo Express that had nearly crushed the Marines defending Henderson Field. It was the Tokyo Express that kept the Japanese army alive. And it was the Tokyo Express that the U.S. Navy was now determined to stop, no matter the cost. On the night of November 30th, 1942, in darkness so complete that even the horizon disappeared, the U.S. Navy sent out a powerful cruiser force to ambush what they believed was just another supply run. Admiral Carleton Wright commanded Task Force 67, 4 heavy cruisers, 1 light cruiser, 4 destroyers. He believed he had every advantage: 4 cruisers' worth of firepower, radar systems that could see through darkness, a tightly organized formation with discipline and training. What he didn't know was that he was sailing directly into a trap, because steaming down the Slot that night was Rear Admiral Raizō Tanaka, a man feared even by other Japanese commanders for his brilliance in night combat. His force was small, 8 destroyers, but each of those destroyers carried the deadliest torpedo ever built, the Type 93, Long Lance, a weapon decades ahead of anything the Americans possessed, and Tanaka was ready to use it. Shut the Pacific. In late 1942, a balance on a knife edge. To understand why this battle mattered so deeply, you have to understand the situation on Guadalcanal at this point in the war. The U.S. Marines had been fighting nonstop for months. Malaria, dysentery, starvation, exposure. More Marines were being lost to disease than to Japanese bullets. Yet they held on. The Japanese army, meanwhile, was in even worse shape. Whole units were down to a few dozen men. Soldiers collapsed on march routes. Many were too weak to carry rifles. Japan's problem wasn't lack of courage or discipline. It was logistics. Their army on Guadalcanal was starving. The Tokyo Express was their only lifeline. But even that lifeline was fraying. American aircraft from Henderson Field attacked supply barges during the day. Submarines lurked offshore. Fuel shortages were already gutting the Japanese Navy. This meant that every supply run had to count. And Tanaka, determined, fearless, relentless, was the man chosen to deliver those supplies no matter the odds. But this night, Tanaka wasn't bringing food or medicine. He was bringing torpedoes, a lot of torpedoes, because Japanese command suspected the Americans would attempt an interception. And Tanaka, master of night battle, prepared accordingly. Admiral Carleton Wright, a capable officer with a critical blind spot. Admiral Wright, commanding the American force, was brave, intelligent, and well-trained. But he had one major flaw, one shared by many U.S. commanders in 1942. He trusted radar, but not the people who operated it. Radar was still new, still mysterious, still distrusted by older officers who believed battles should be fought with eyesight and searchlights. Wright had radar advantage. He had firepower advantage. He had numerical advantage. But he also had something the Japanese did not: a chaotic command structure. His destroyers expected to launch torpedoes first. His cruisers expected to open gunfire first. His radar operators expected to guide the fight. Wright didn't fully commit to any doctrine. He halfway trusted everything and fully trusted nothing. That unusual hesitation would prove fatal. Tanaka's night fighting machine. While Wright's force moved uncertainly through the dark, Tanaka's destroyers approached with silent confidence. Japanese night training was legendary. Crews practiced fighting without lights. Lookouts trained their eyes for hours to distinguish silhouettes. Gunners practiced detecting muzzle flashes. Helmsmen drilled on evasive maneuvers in total darkness. Torpedo officers trained to memorize firing angles and spreads. Tanaka's force was an orchestra, each sailor in tune with the others, every movement drilled countless times. And they had the long lance torpedo, oxygen-powered, leaving almost no trail, extremely fast, incredibly long-ranged, carrying a warhead large enough to break a cruiser in half, nearly impossible for Americans to detect. If used correctly, a single salvo could wipe out half a task force, and Tanaka planned to use them perfectly. 3:06. The first detection. At 6 minutes past 11, American radar detected Tanaka's formation. This should have been the Americans' moment of triumph, proof that radar was superior to human eyesight. The destroyers in Wright's vanguard requested permission to fire torpedoes immediately. They had perfect firing angles. They had surprise. They had radar-confirmed range. But Admiral Wright hesitated. He wanted to close distance. He wanted visual confirmation. He wanted to open with gunfire, not torpedoes. Against a Japanese night fighting force, this was the worst possible decision, because the moment American guns opened fire, they would reveal their exact positions, and Tanaka's torpedoes would already be in the water. At the night, the U.S. Navy lost 3 ships in 30 minutes. At the moment everything went wrong, the American destroyers at the front of the formation, Fletcher, Perkins, Maury, and Drayton, stood ready to launch torpedoes. Their commanders knew Japanese night tactics. They knew the Type 93 could devastate an entire cruiser force. They understood that torpedoes, not gunfire, should begin a night engagement. But Admiral Wright, aboard the flagship Minneapolis, refused. He wanted the cruisers to fire first. He believed his 8-inch guns would shatter the Japanese formation immediately. He feared that if his destroyers launched torpedoes too early, they might hit friendly ships during the chaotic maneuvering. And so, with radar screaming that the enemy was only minutes away, Wright gave the order. Cruisers opened fire. This was the single most disastrous command given that night. It gave Tanaka everything he needed. The flashes that killed surprise. At 23:21, the sky exploded with orange light as the American cruisers fired their opening salvos. Great thunderous blasts echoed across Iron Bottom Sound. Shells streaked through the darkness like burning meteors. The water lit up from horizon to horizon. For a moment, American sailors felt triumph. "We hit them! We got him!" Voices shouted on Minneapolis's bridge. But they were wrong. Yes, a Japanese destroyer, Takanami, had been struck and was burning fiercely. But in that moment of blinding light, the Americans revealed their exact position, speed, and course. And Tanaka wasn't firing guns. He was firing torpedoes. Before the first American shell had even reached its target, Tanaka's destroyers unleashed a full broadside. 32 long lance torpedoes, launched in perfect spreads, aimed at the gun flashes of the American cruisers. Timed to hit moving targets minutes later, and the Americans had no idea. The deadliest weapon in the Pacific opens the night. Long lance torpedoes slid silently beneath the waves, their oxygen engines producing almost no wake. They were invisible, unstoppable, and heading straight toward the heart of the American formation. Meanwhile, the U.S. cruisers continued firing. They were convinced they were winning. What they didn't realize was that Tanaka's destroyers, still unseen, had already turned away at maximum speed. They had delivered their killing blow and were melting back into the night. Tanaka didn't stay to duel guns. He didn't attempt to trade blows. He struck like a ghost and disappeared. The first American cruiser is hit, Minneapolis. The first long lance found its mark at 2327. Minneapolis Admiral Wright's flagship was charging forward, preparing to unleash another salvo. Then the ocean erupted beneath her bow. A massive white flash tore through the night as a long lance torpedo detonated under her forward magazines. The explosion was so violent that sailors on other ships thought she had been split in two. The entire bow folded downward, a twisted mass of steel hanging like a broken jaw. Fuel poured into the water. Flames shot upward from ruptured tanks. The forward turret was gone, buried beneath debris. Minneapolis was crippled instantly. Her speed dropped. Her steering faltered. Her bow burned like a floating torch. And this was only the beginning. The second hit. New Orleans is mutilated. New Orleans, following closely behind Minneapolis, attempted to avoid the burning flagship. Her helmsman turned sharply, a move that saved the ship from colliding with Minneapolis, but placed her directly in the path of a second long lance. It struck just forward of turret number 2. The explosion ripped off the entire bow from the bridge to the first turret. The front third of the ship was simply gone. Sailors in the forward compartments never had a chance. Those on deck felt the shock wave travel through their entire bodies. Debris rained down for nearly a minute. Flaming wreckage splashed around the ship like falling stars. Yet, unbelievably, New Orleans remained afloat. She steamed forward with her bow missing, her twisted, jagged remains cutting the waves like a butchered carcass. The third American cruiser is hit, Pensacola. Pensacola was next in line. Her crew had watched the destruction unfolding ahead of them in disbelief. At first, they assumed they were seeing secondary explosions or chain reactions. No one imagined that 3 separate torpedoes had struck 3 separate cruisers. Pensacola attempted to maneuver around the wreckage, but in doing so she exposed her port side directly to an incoming torpedo. The long lance hit her just below the mainmast. Flames erupted across the ship. Fuel oil sprayed into the air and ignited instantly. An enormous pillar of fire rose toward the sky. Pensacola's crew fought desperately to contain the blaze, but it spread rapidly across the decks and into the engine rooms. Within minutes, she was burning from midship to stern, a beacon of fire visible for miles. Now American confusion and Japanese discipline. The U.S. formation was now in chaos. One cruiser crippled, one cruiser missing its entire bow, one cruiser engulfed in flames, the remaining ships swerving wildly in the dark. Yet still no one knew what had happened. Reports flew across radios. "We've hit a mine! Collision ahead! Magazine explosion! Unknown torpedoes in the water!" In reality, it was all the same cause. Tanaka's destroyers, now long gone, had delivered a near-perfect torpedo attack. Japanese sailors aboard the retreating ships heard the distant explosions. Some cheered, some prayed, but all understood that they had just achieved an outcome far greater than expected. Tanaka, calm and precise, issued only one order: maintain position, return to base. He never bragged. He never celebrated. He simply acknowledged the results and prepared for the next operation. The fourth cruiser is targeted Northampton. Behind the burning wreckage, the fourth cruiser, Northampton, attempted to take command. She maneuvered smoothly, avoiding debris and turning to pursue the Japanese force. Her crew was ready to fight, ready to avenge the devastation ahead. But the long lance torpedoes had been fired in layers, and the second wave was still approaching. At 23:48, Northampton was struck by 2 torpedoes in quick succession. The impacts tore open massive holes along her port side. Water rushed in at terrifying speed. The ship began to list sharply. Unlike the first 3 cruisers, Northampton was not destined to survive. As the night the U.S. Navy lost 3 ships in 30 minutes. Northampton's final struggle. When the first torpedo struck Northampton, Her crew staggered as if punched by a giant hand. The blast reverberated through every hallway, every compartment, every steel plate in the ship. But they still believed she could be saved. Then, the second torpedo hit. This one tore open a gaping wound near the engine rooms, rupturing fuel tanks and flooding multiple decks at once. The lights flickered, bulkheads groaned, the ship rolled violently to port before righting itself barely. Captain Willard A. Kitts, refusing to surrender, ordered counter-flooding to stabilize the list. Damage control teams fought their way through dark, flooding compartments, closing watertight doors, dropping hoses into flame-filled rooms, shouting orders in knee-high seawater. For a moment, miraculously, their efforts worked. Northampton straightened. Her engines responded. A cheer went up across the bridge. The old cruiser veteran of countless operations still had life in her, but the ocean was already claiming her. Water poured into wounded compartments faster than pumps could remove it. Several engineering spaces were already submerged. The list returned worse than before. Captain Kitts faced the truth. Northampton could not be saved. At 01:30, more than an hour after the torpedo hit, he gave the order that every captain dreads but every sailor understands. Abandon ship. The crew gathered calmly along the rails, descending rope ladders into black water stained with fuel. Destroyers moved in to rescue survivors, illuminating the scene with searchlights. At 03:04, with her stern rising sharply above the surface, USS Northampton slipped beneath the waves. She had fought longer than expected, held together longer than the damage suggested she could, and given her crew time to escape, but she was gone. Another cruiser added to the graveyard of Iron Bottom Sound. Numb the aftermath, fire, smoke, and confusion. As Northampton sank, the other cruisers were locked in their own desperate battles for survival. Minneapolis, bow blown off, drifted like a wounded giant fires around her forward magazine, casting orange reflections across the sea. Her crew jettisoned wreckage, used pumps to control flooding, and slowly backed away, stern first. New Orleans, missing her entire bow, sailed in reverse to keep water from pouring into the jagged open wound at her front. Her sailors fashioned makeshift bulkheads from mattresses, wood, and scrap metal. Some prayed quietly as they worked. Pensacola was still burning violently. Columns of flame reached the height of her mainmast. Fuel fires raged uncontrollably across the deck. Her crew formed bucket brigades while others used hoses to push the fire back from ammunition storage areas. For more than an hour, every surviving cruiser fought not the Japanese but the ocean itself. And Tanaka? He was gone, far out of range, untouched, his destroyers moving smoothly toward their next rendezvous point. As the Americans tried to make sense of the disaster on the bridge of Honolulu, the only major ship still fully operational, officers stared in disbelief at the carnage unfolding around them. Radar had not saved them. Gunfire had not saved them. Superior tonnage had not saved them. Even now, some officers still refused to accept the truth. It must have been mines. No destroyer force could do this much damage. We fired first. How did this happen? But gradually, painfully, the real explanation settled in. The Japanese had struck with a weapon the Americans did not fully understand and had not prepared for: the long lance. A torpedo so fast, silent, and long-ranged that most American officers still considered its capabilities impossible. The chasen of the root cause, an outdated American doctrine. In the days following the battle, U.S. Navy intelligence and operational analysts tore apart the after-action reports. They identified several fatal flaws. American commanders relied too heavily on cruisers. U.S. doctrine prioritized gunfire, not torpedoes. Cruisers were designed for daylight engagements at long range. At night, they were slow to react and easy to target. Destroyers were not allowed to fire first. This was the single greatest operational mistake. Had American destroyers launched torpedoes immediately, Tanaka's formation might have suffered heavy losses. Radar was used incorrectly. Radar detection was treated as advisory, not authoritative. Officers wanted visual confirmation before committing major actions. This erased the one advantage radar provided. Japanese night training was underestimated. The Imperial Navy had drilled night attacks for 2 decades without interruption. Japan's destroyer crews were among the best in the world. Long lance torpedoes were not taken seriously. Many American intelligence officers simply disbelieved the reports. They thought Japan lacked the technological sophistication. They were wrong. Tanaka's genius and why he won. Rear Admiral Raizō Tanaka became a legend after Tassafaronga. He was not reckless. He was not arrogant. He did not underestimate his enemy. Tanaka won because he kept formation discipline, used darkness as a weapon, launched torpedoes first, avoided gun duels, retreated at the exact right moment, trusted the training of his crews, used the long lance to maximum effect. He understood something the American commander did not. Night battles are won before the enemy even knows they've begun. In his official after-action report, Tanaka wrote only one modest line. The enemy fired first, but we struck first. It was the perfect summary of the entire engagement. The cost in men and ships. Tassafaronga was not the deadliest battle of the war. It was not the largest. It did not decide the fate of Guadalcanal alone, but it was one of the most painful tactical defeats the U.S. Navy suffered in the entire Pacific. 1-1, heavy cruisers sunk. 3 heavy cruisers crippled. Over 400 American sailors killed or wounded, and the Japanese, they lost. 1 destroyer, 197 men. The gap was staggering. A single Japanese destroyer force had practically dismantled half of an American cruiser group, and they did it in 30 minutes. What the U.S. Navy learned and how it changed the war. In the weeks after Tassafaronga, the U.S. Navy implemented rapid, sweeping changes in doctrine. These changes would shape American naval power for the rest of the war. 1. Destroyers were empowered to launch torpedoes first. No more waiting for cruiser approval. Destroyers became hunters, not escorts. 2. Radar training was prioritized. Operators were placed at the heart of fire control. Their data became primary, not secondary. 3. Night battle tactics were rewritten. The U.S. Navy studied Japanese maneuvers and adopted their spacing, approach angles, and withdrawal patterns. 4. Torpedo defense was enhanced, new zigzag patterns and alert protocols were implemented. 5. Cruiser groups were redesigned. Heavy cruisers were no longer used as the backbone of night attack forces. The lessons of this catastrophe helped the U.S. Navy win later battles. Kula Gulf, Vela Gulf, Empress Augusta Bay, Cape St. George. By 1944, the U.S. Navy had mastered night combat, but they had paid dearly to learn. The night the U.S. Navy lost 3 ships in 30 minutes, WW2 near the dawn after disaster. When the first gray light of dawn crept across Iron Bottom Sound, it revealed a scene that sailors would remember for the rest of their lives. The water was littered with burnt debris, twisted steel, shattered wood, oil slicks that stretched for miles, and small clusters of survivors clinging to rafts or floating wreckage. The sun illuminated the outlines of the damaged cruisers. Minneapolis, her nose entirely missing, sitting low and heavy in the water. New Orleans, moving backwards under her own power, her bow gone as if bitten off. Pensacola, charred black from bow to stern, still smoldering. And the empty stretch of ocean where Northampton had slipped beneath the waves. It did not look like a defeated fleet. It looked like a fleet that had been ambushed by a force it never fully understood. And in a sense, that was exactly what had happened. The Marines on Guadalcanal. See the fire at Henderson Field, still held by exhausted Marines. The eastern sky glowed orange throughout the night. They thought at first it was another Japanese bombardment, another night where battleships hurled shells into jungle lines. But as the hours passed, they realized the glow was not from incoming fire. It was from the American ships themselves, burning, struggling, and fighting for survival. Some Marines watched quietly. Others stood in disbelief. These cruisers were supposed to protect them. Now, the Marines wondered if the sea itself had turned against them. But the U.S. Navy was not defeated. Not yet. Chud the damage control miracles. Even in catastrophe, the American sailors demonstrated extraordinary skill. Minneapolis, her crew improvised a false bow made from coconut logs, mattresses, canvas, and steel beams. It wasn't pretty, but it kept the water at bay long enough to steam backward to Tulagi. New Orleans, her surviving compartments were flooded intentionally to restore balance. Every working engine reversed power to prevent sinking. Sailors patched the bow with wooden beams scavenged from wreckage. One officer later said, "We were sailing a third of a ship, but it was still our ship, and we weren't giving her up." Pensacola. Despite towering flames, her crew saved the ship by flooding compartments, isolating burning fuel tanks, and forming human chains to pass ammunition out of danger zones. The burn marks on her hull would remain visible until the end of the war. On the night Tanaka became a legend, while American crews fought for their ships' lives, the Japanese destroyers under Raizō Tanaka were long gone. Tanaka calmly recorded the events in his logbook. He did not celebrate. He did not boast. To him, the victory was simply the result of discipline and obedience. His destroyers regrouped at full speed and resumed their supply mission, dropping barrels of food and ammunition near Guadalcanal's shore for soldiers to retrieve. Then he turned north, already planning the next run, already preparing for the next encounter. Tanaka was not interested in glory. He was interested in winning the war. And for one night, he had delivered one of the most lopsided naval victories in Japanese history. The U.S. Navy's shock and anger. Back at Allied headquarters in Noumea, the after-action reports stunned Admiral William Halsey. He read them twice, then a third time. How could 8 Japanese destroyers inflict such damage? How did radar-equipped cruisers allow themselves to be ambushed? Why had the destroyers not launched torpedoes? How was it possible that 3 ships were crippled before the Americans even understood the situation? Halsey did not hide his frustration. This must never happen again. It was the beginning of a doctrinal revolution. How the Navy changed. The end of old thinking. The lessons of Tassafaronga were painful, but they transformed the U.S. Navy into the most capable night-fighting force on Earth. 1. Radar became king. No more waiting for visual sighting. If radar detected a threat, the fleet acted immediately. 2. Destroyers gained autonomy. Destroyer captains were authorized to fire torpedoes without cruiser approval. 3. Torpedo tactics were rewritten. American destroyers began launching large spreads early, just as the Japanese had done for years. 4. Cruiser roles changed. Heavy cruisers were no longer placed at the front of formation or used aggressively at night. 5. The Long Lance was taken seriously. Captured torpedoes were analyzed. Training was updated. Anti-torpedo doctrine was rewritten. 6. New leaders emerged. Commanders, like Arleigh Burke, who studied Japanese tactics obsessively, would go on to win astonishing night battles later in the war. The U.S. Navy learned from the defeat. Japan, however, did not learn from its victories, and that would make all the difference. The strategic impact. Japan won the battle, but lost the war. Japan emerged victorious at Tassafaronga, but strategically the battle changed nothing. Why? Because the Japanese could not replace lost ships. They could not replace trained night-fighting crews. They could not replace fuel, torpedoes, or engines. Every destroyer Japan lost was irreplaceable. Every American ship lost was replaced by new construction, faster, stronger, more advanced. And Guadalcanal? Despite the stunning victory, Japan failed to deliver enough supplies during the night. Their troops continued to starve. Their offensive strength collapsed. Within months, Japanese forces abandoned the island entirely. Tassafaronga was a tactical triumph and a strategic irrelevance. The human cost. Voices from the survivors. Sailors who survived that night carried memories they never forgot. One survivor from Northampton recalled, The water was burning. I didn't know water could burn. A Minneapolis crewman said, "We thought the whole Pacific had exploded." A New Orleans sailor remembered, "I looked toward the bow, and there was no bow, just open water where the ship should have been." And aboard Pensacola, a young fireman later described, "The flames were taller than the mast. I thought we were in hell." These were the voices of men who faced the unimaginable and lived to tell the tale. What if the Americans had made the right choice? History always leaves behind the question, what if? What if the destroyers had launched torpedoes first? What if the cruisers had stayed silent? What if Admiral Wright had trusted radar completely? What if the Americans had zigzagged immediately? What if Tanaka had been caught in the open, delivering supplies instead of preparing for battle? The entire engagement could have reversed. Japanese destroyers could have been sunk early. Supply lines to Guadalcanal could have collapsed. The battle for the Solomons might have ended months sooner, but none of that happened, because the ocean rewards preparation and punishes hesitation. Tanaka prepared, Wright hesitated, and the results became history. Chuck conclusion. A night that changed everything. The Battle of Tassafaronga stands as one of the most dramatic reminders of the power of discipline, training, and technology. It was a night where Japanese skill overcame American firepower, torpedoes defeated cruisers, silence defeated confidence, and 8 destroyers humbled a mighty task force. But perhaps the most important lesson is this: defeat can teach more than victory. Tassafaronga forced the U.S. Navy to reinvent itself, to abandon outdated doctrine, to respect its enemy, to value radar, to trust its destroyer captains, to understand the true nature of night warfare. And because of those lessons, the U.S. Navy would dominate every major naval battle from 1943 onward. By war's end, Tanaka's victory was remembered, but America's transformation won the Pacific. That night, the U.S. Navy lost 3 ships in 30 minutes. But from the ashes of that disaster, a stronger Navy emerged. A Navy that would never again be caught in the darkness. A Navy that learned to strike first. A Navy that, in time, would win the greatest naval war in human history.